and welcome to the Election Show. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer. I'm an associate professor of political science at Fordham University and co-host of the FAQ NYC podcast. Joining me today, as always, via Zoom is Matt McDermott, communications strategist and vice president of Whitman Insight Strategies. And also with me today is political analyst and political science professor at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Great to be with you again.
It's another year that has happened in a week, I should say. Lincoln, I'll start with you this week. Let's start with the state of the president, and then we'll move on to a discussion of the vice presidential debate. But right now, the president is saying that he is healed, he is cured, it's a miracle. He's our favorite president, as he's released some videos, but people have not seen the president live. He's called into Fox and Friends, and he's released some pre-taped videos. But because the American public has not seen him, there's some concerns about his health, but there's some other real concerns about his mental state, since he's taking a mixture of a cocktail of drugs that very few Americans, if any, have taken. And there's some real questions about what these steroids are possibly doing to his brain and also his physical health. If we look at his tweets, we know that they are getting more and more erratic and dare I say, alarming to a lot of folks. We do know that as of Friday, October 9th, he's going to have a live interview with Fox and have a doctor on with him who will, I guess, give a bill of health. But sadly, because the president has lied to the American public for so long, several people still don't believe anything that's coming out of not just the president's mouth, but the entire White House and the Republican administration about the state of his health. Lincoln, where are we and what's your analysis of what's going on right now?
Well, where we are is this is kind of third-rate dictator stuff. If you saw this in a movie about an obscure country somewhere else, you would say it's implausible that any leader, no matter how much of an authoritarian, would ever act so erratically. So I think we should start with that. Secondly, on this show, we're not doctors. As I tell my student, my PhD is in political science, not medicine. So I want to be careful about making medical assessments, right? What the medical experts are telling us is that COVID, when you get it, runs a course. And the course lasts longer than the time between when Trump got it, which was somewhat the very end of September, and today, which is to say he still has it and he's still infectious. That seems to be the consensus, not from political consultants and analysts, but from doctors who work outside the White House. Now, the doctors who are directly involved with the White House seem to be saying something different, but even they are hedging a little bit. And secondly, we also know whenever you've had treatment for anything, whether you've gone in for a root canal surgery, which is as fun as it sounds, and the doctor gives you some kind of painkiller, it doesn't mean there's no pain. It just means the medicine is addressing the pain. So when Trump says he feels good, on some level, that's good for Trump, but it is no meaningful assessment of his physical state. It doesn't mean that COVID is gone. It just means it's being treated. We also know that if you've ever taken steroids, I'm not talking about the kinds that people like Mark McGuire used to take, but the kinds you take for a sickness or a disease or an illness. I've taken them for bad allergy attacks, and it makes you feel a little high energy, super happy, even a little high. And given Trump's mood swings that the public has seen over the last 3.5 years, it's hard to tell whether it's the steroid speaking or whether it's Trump. So kind of cue the Trump on steroids jokes. But it's very dangerous. It is very dangerous, not just because of the president's erratic behavior, but because roughly 35% of the country still take their cues from the president, right? And we don't have to look much further than the state of Michigan yesterday, where militia members who are, we almost certainly Trump supporters, had a kind of crackpot plan to kidnap the governor, who is a Democrat and who is, I think, doing a very fine job trying to fight COVID in that state, and who Trump has targeted and bickered with online in the past. And as we head to the election, this makes it more important because he is just flat out saying, here is the plan to steal the election, and if you're with me, please follow these instructions. And he's yelling that louder and louder, and fear-mongering and race baiting. And this is what's happened with Trump and the COVID and the medicine this is Trump to his logical extreme. This is kind of super Trump, and that's where we are 4 weeks or so until the election.
And it should be noted, Lincoln, that those 13 men that have been arrested were not only planning to kidnap the Governor Whitmer of Michigan, they were also planning to kill the police officers who were charged with her protection. So we're seeing vigilantes actually now targeting not just elected officials, but also law enforcement. So
Right.
that's quite a dangerous proposition that the president has set up. Matt, you know, as Lincoln has laid out, I mean, we see this erratic behavior. We know that the president announced that he had COVID. He and the first lady, who we've not seen or talked to or heard of, and the president has not mentioned her at all. But he announced it essentially late Thursday night, early Friday morning, just in time for the markets to control themselves. But the president, the timeline is off, and so the American public still hasn't gotten a clear picture as to when he was possibly exposed, or when he knew that he was exposed. Was he possibly at the debate with Joe Biden, knowing that he could have been exposed? He is now saying that it was not the super spreader event for Amy Coney Barrett, where he and several other high-ranking Republicans clearly are now testing positive. He's
Right.
saying it's the day after, when he met with Gold Star military families, and they like to hug him and touch him. And he says that that's probably when he received COVID, or contracted the coronavirus. But there's still an unclear timeline, and there's still an unclear timeline as to how frequently he's being tested. And this is a president who, as Lincoln has said, has gone out. I mean, he's not only taken a joyride and put Secret Service members at risk, but he's now in the White House, and by all accounts, coming out of the White House, he's not quarantining in his bedroom. He's moving about the White House, where staff and butlers and valets are now at risk of contracting coronavirus. So there's this disconnect that the president has, where it's all about him, but he's putting several hundreds of people in jeopardy every time he moves about. And we've now seen an uptick in coronavirus cases in Washington, D.C., where they were on a nice steady downtick. So what's your analysis right now as to what we should do with this growingly erratic president, who may still be highly infectious?
Look, we are seeing in real time why a White House that lies to the American people is such a threat. And not just through the lens of public health, but through the lens of our very country's national security. You watch some of the interviews that the president has given over the last day or two. He was on Thursday night with Sean Hannity for a pretty extended period of time by mobile. He wasn't on video. It was just his voice. And you could hear that he was physically unwell. He was gasping for air. He was raspy. He was coughing throughout the interview. I mean, anyone who listens to that interview would know that Donald Trump is not healthy right now. And yet his medical team is putting out these statements saying he's perfectly back to normal. He has no symptoms. He's ready to get back out on the campaign trail. And we know for a fact that that's just not correct, because we can all hear his voice. And so there's just a problem here, wherein the White House continues to lie to the American people in a way that they have for years now. And I think when you look at voters, they're just frankly sick of it. I mean, we have had years now where from the very beginning of this administration, you had press secretaries standing up before the American people and lying about the crowd size at the inauguration. And so, you know, it's sort of apropos that we're sitting here a few weeks from the election now with those same people lying about the president's health. It has been years now of just untruths, misinformation, and lies from this White House. And now we're seeing the very real effects of that. And you can see it in the polling as we get into the final weeks of this campaign. Joe Biden is clearly riding probably the strongest wave of this election so far, in part because of the debate performance that Donald Trump put in. It now looks like he might have had coronavirus while on that stage, given the timeline that you pointed out. And I think moving forward, we're in a really odd situation right now, wherein the president is essentially refusing to follow the rules and participate in the debates in a way that's been set forth by the debate commission. And so we'll see to what extent he's even out talking to voters in the remaining weeks of this campaign, because at the moment now we've gone days without seeing the president in person. We've gone days without actually seeing live video of him. He's held up in his bedroom. He's clearly still unwell. And it's just not a great position for him to be in the remaining weeks of this campaign, not only because he's sick, but because they continue to lie to the American people about what we can see before our very eyes.
What's been fascinating to see is how the doctors at Walter Reed, one of the most respected medical institutions in our nation, have become these political actors who give these press conferences that say very little in the way of factual evidence, because they're very clear that the president is watching them, and they're giving kind of post-game, our star player is fantastic. And as you've said, we can see and hear that that's not the case. I'm also fascinated that the Republican Party has now tried to spin this to say, going back to your comment about polling, that Trump is the real American and the real leader because he decided to catch COVID, to show the American people that it's not a big deal. And Joe Biden's hiding out in his basement and wearing a mask, which is the antithesis of what real scientists and doctors have told us, that we should limit our exposure to one another during this time period, and that we should wear masks. And so the spin that Donald Trump has done the country a favor by catching COVID, because that makes him a real leader, to me is just absolutely mind-boggling. And it brings up sort of my second question for you both. And Matt, I'll stick with you, and then Lincoln, I want you to follow up. Is it time for us to have a real discussion about the 25th Amendment? And the 25th Amendment would be possibly removing this president, whether it's temporarily or permanently, from his duties as president, as Lincoln mentioned, because he's on a combination of drug cocktails that are possibly impairing his judgment, and maybe he should tend to his health at this point. Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, look, sort of 2 points from my perspective. One is the coverage of the past week and Donald Trump's deteriorated health really speaks to just how far past the over and window we've gotten with this administration. We've never had a president medevaced to a hospital and not had a serious conversation in this country about whether that president should be ceding the authority of the presidency to the vice president. In any other administration, that would be obvious. The president was clearly incapacitated. He was clearly, as both you and Lincoln have mentioned, on a number of drug cocktails, experimental drug cocktails, steroids, and was not in a capacity to lead this country through potential national security crises. And yet, it hardly was a topic of conversation because of just the insanity of the past few years and the expectation that Donald Trump is just an unhinged president and we should come to accept that. That's one part of it. I think the other is you're starting to see in the last day or two Republicans starting to jump ship from this administration. You had the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell come out this week and essentially say he hasn't visited the White House in months now because he's not comfortable with the health protocols they've had in place, indicting publicly this president and his White House in terms of the public health mismanagement after coronavirus. And you've also then had a number of Republican officials over the last day or two essentially say anonymously so far that they're pulling money from this presidential campaign and moving it into Senate races to try to hold the Senate. There's clearly efforts at place among Republicans, particularly among donors, to start moving money to Senate races, knowing that if Donald Trump loses, they need to try and hold the Senate. And so whether or not we get to a, frankly, constitutional crisis about the ability of this president to serve out the remainder of his term, I think what we'll see more likely is Republicans start to shift both money and resources down ballot to try to salvage what they can out of this election, given what we've seen in the past few days of Joe Biden just continuing to increase his lead in national polls, continuing to increase his lead in some of these important swing states, and frankly, a president who just is not well enough to campaign in the remaining weeks of this race.
So thank you, Matt, because Lincoln, I want to rephrase this question to pull in some of what Matt has said, because we know that the presidential coattails, his ability to pull other Republicans from down ballot races across the finish line. That window is rapidly closing, and we're seeing Lindsey Graham in the fight for his life. We're seeing senators in Arizona and Georgia really in a struggle, and it's looking like the Senate could go Democratically and the House would remain democratically, and that would spell disaster for Republicans. And so we know that the strategists and the donors are starting to rethink their past financial strategies. But for the 25th Amendment, we would need 2/3 of Congress to come to the table. Do you really think, seeing a slight crack with Mitch McConnell, we would definitely need way more Republicans to come to the table and say, this is a real problem and we're concerned? Do you see that happening? We haven't seen it in 4 years. They have not broken ranks with the president on much of anything. But as Matt aptly mentioned, that quick conversation with Mitch McConnell when he says, I have not been to the White House since August 6th. And we know that he and the president are in constant communication. But the jab was, because I am not comfortable with their protocols, meaning the president clearly is running a White House that I do not feel safe in. Mitch McConnell is also 78 years old. So where do you see this 25th Amendment conversation? Is it a realistic conversation knowing how the Republican Party has been so calcified in their support for Donald Trump?
I see this 25th Amendment as something that people who don't like Donald Trump will chat about for a few weeks, but it's not going anywhere. The time for the 25th Amendment, in my view, was January 21st, 2017. The notion that Donald Trump was ever mentally fit for office is absurd, right? I spoke to a Republican psychologist before the election, and I said to him after the election, I said to him, what would you do if Donald Trump walked into your office? And he said, people that narcissistic never come into my office unless the judge sends them, right? He was never mentally fit for office. The Republican position, yes, Mitch McConnell says something that is straightforward and frank, but the Republican position is one of extreme cowardice. It is one of absolute immorality. They have stuck by this leader as Americans are dying because they're afraid of hurting his feelings. But it's something else. It's also extremely stupid, right? One of the things that Republicans, or we don't really discuss enough, is that Trump is a tax. He is a drag on the Republican Party. There are no Trump coattails. There are senators who may need to pull Trump across the finish line in their states. Since Trump got elected in 2016, the Republicans have lost almost every special election. They have lost every election. They have, in the 2018 blue wave, was much bigger than it should have been. In a midterm election with the economy that strong and a normal functioning Republican president, the Democrats would have picked up some seats, but they might not have flipped the House. Going into this election, the Republicans knew that now when we say the Republicans, Trump is the leader of the party, but any smart strategic Republican consultant, donor, senator, member of the House, member of the state legislature knew, at least if they bothered to look at the data, that Trump was hurting their ticket. Ironically, now that we look back on something that happened 150 years ago, that is to say in January, when the Senate voted to acquit Donald Trump, the Republicans in the Senate, they sealed their fate. It is very clear now that if Mike Pence had become president on, February 10th of this year, the Republican Party going into this election would be in much better shape, because even a right-wing bigot like Mike Pence would have been smart enough to turn this crisis over to the experts and to speak words of sympathy to the American people. And that is all Donald Trump needed to do to be in a pretty good shape to win this election. And Pence would be even better shape because he is not as erratic and doesn't damage himself and his party over and over again. So the Republican Party, because of out of loyalty and cowardice, they stuck by this man who has as much business running for the country as I have pitching in the World Series in a couple of weeks. And now they are paying for a price for it. And I could not be happier about it. I hope they all go down. History will not be kind to any of them, least of all this authoritarian buffoon who is now sitting in the White House.
I love how Lincoln can always work in a baseball, a little bit about baseball.
Always.
So, Lincoln, I do want to stick with you because you brought up Mike Pence. And this past week, Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris squared off in their first and only VP debate. Obviously, lots of pundits want to talk about the fly and folks on the internet who landed on Mike Pence's head. But there were some other really important discussions that were had. For me, one of the most important questions that was asked and not answered was, would Trump-Pence administration support a peaceful transference of power? And Pence sidestepped that question, which made me quite nervous. We know that Mike Pence can lie, like I said, like hot knife on a butter, because he is a very Donald Trumpian figure, just as my colleague said, he's just on decaf. He can look at you in the eyes and lie to your face, but he's very good at it, and he's smooth, and he's very calm. So I totally agree with you that a Pence presidency would be quite damaging, but a lot more sane for a lot of people's psyches. But I definitely think that he push agendas across, but he doesn't make things about himself like the president. He actually did express sympathy for the families who have lost loved ones, the 210,000 plus families. Now it's at 213,000 plus families who have lost someone. But what are some of the takeaways for you from the VP debate and the format? And I saw the plexiglass, which did not make me comfortable just because Mike Pence did not look well. Many people said that he had pink eye, and several people posted that that was their beginning symptom of COVID. And so we know that there's some real health concerns, not just for the vice president, but all of the people who were in the audience. We know his wife came up on stage without a mask. So we're seeing this consistent flouting of the rules that have been set for this administration, and they just refuse to follow them. But what are some of your takeaways?
Well, first of all, it's the 210,000 families. That's a very real thing. My family is one of those families. I'm sure a lot of our viewers have shared that tragedy. So this is very real. A couple of things struck me about that debate. Well, you talked about Mike Pence, but there was someone else on the stage who I think we should mention a little bit, and that's Kamala Harris. And she had a very difficult task because in American politics, an African-American woman has a whole different set of standards. And
no, you don't say.
I know, I read that. and I'm going to give you a baseball term now. Kamala Harris didn't hit a home run because if she had, it would have backfired. She hit a single up the middle. That's what she needed to do. If she had eviscerated Mike Pence, as many partisans would have liked to have seen her do, and based on her record and what we've seen on other debates and what we've seen from her in the U.S. Senate, you know that she has the intellect and the ability to do that. If she had done that, it would have backfired. So Kamala Harris, I think, gets an A for temperament and conduct. There were a couple things with her performance that I thought her answer on court packing, which the Republicans are going to hammer home now. Unless you mention what Mitch McConnell did with Merrick Garland, that article is weaker. That argument is weaker. So I wish he had hit that harder.
But here's the thing, Lincoln. I said the same exact thing, but I figured that was deliberate because I figured that Pence was prepared for her to talk about Merrick Garland, and she did not walk into that honey trap.
And her point, but what she did say, which landed well, is not a single one of those federal judges are African American. She got that line out there. I thought that was a good line. Regarding Mike Pence, the first vice presidential debate I watched closely was in 1984 between George H.W. Bush and Geraldine Ferraro, which also happened to be between a man and a woman. And what Mike Pence said today is what you say when you're the running mate and you're a Republican running for re-election. It was totally disconnected from the reality of just the sheer strangeness and danger raised by the Trump administration. It was about freedom and low taxes, this nonsensical answer about COVID that he's proud of the American people. The American people have made sacrifices. You know what? I'm sorry, but the American people didn't make sacrifices because Mike Pence and Donald Trump and their enablers told them not to. And they didn't wear masks so they could breathe the air of freedom and kill their fellow Americans. So I think he was dead wrong about that, but he lied very smoothly, which, is more than Trump can do.
As Lincoln has mentioned, there's some racial and gender dynamics that are very complicated for the American public to digest. Many people said if Kamala Harris had gotten up there and knitted a scarf for an hour and a half, people would have said that she was too angry. So we know her sparring partner is a former South Bend mayor, Pete Buttigieg, and I think that he knows Pence quite well. I think he prepared her quite well. There were several points that she did not stick, but there were several traps that I thought she did not walk into. What's your assessment of the VP debate?
I am so proud of Kamala Harris. And the reason is because, and you saw this in the male punditry that existed after this debate, just leaning into the misogyny that exists in coverage of our politics today. And she was able to overcome it. And not only was she able to overcome it in the debate, the American voter responded favorably. And you see every poll that's been done after this debate, Kamala Harris won that debate resoundingly, not only on policy, but on performance, which frankly, as a powerful woman in American politics, is incredible. And kudos to her and her team for making the impossible possible, because I think she sets forth a really important path moving forward for women candidates on that federal stage to be able to overcome the issues of sexism in our politics and do so in such an effective way. So kudos to her and her team. My only thoughts on Mike Pence are this. He is a fraud. We all know it. He is a used car salesman, to Lincoln's point, rooted in 1980s white grievance politics. And what's so great about this debate is it showed his shtick for what it is. It only works if you completely ignore the man in the White House. It worked in 2016 when he debated against Tim Kaine, because people saw Mike Pence as just, a middle of the road, honest guy from the Midwest who can bring people together, around a church pew and, sing praises about American unity. That message does not work when there's an incompetent, incoherent, unhinged man in the White House. And so to have believed
who he has
Mike
stood
Pence,
by steadfastly.
Correct. To have believed Mike Pence in that debate, you'd have to just completely ignore what we've all lived through in the last 4 years. Luckily, the American voter is not that stupid.
I agree with you. I think that Mike Pence is dangerous, right? But I thought he actually had a hard needle to thread, which was he knew that his boss was watching and wanting him to dominate, quote unquote, Kamala Harris, but he also knew that that was not going to play well. His interruption strategy was quite interesting because it was similar to Donald Trump's. It was just a little calmer and smoother. And so, as you've said, we've had to live through this past 4 years, which seems as though it's been a series of assaults on the American public. And as Kamala Harris asked the American people, how did you feel when you were hunting for toilet paper? How did you feel when you were trying to figure out your children's education? That was really powerful. Well, we may or may not have a debate next week. So our viewers watching, the president has decided that he most likely will not participate in a virtual debate, and he might hold a rally instead, even though he's possibly still contagious and infectious. So we want to make sure that you all have a voting plan. Make sure you're registered to vote in whatever state you're in. Make sure that not only you have a voting plan, but you and your family members and friends and community members. That's all the time we have. Thank you both so much for being here with me. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. You've been watching The Election Show. Thanks so much. Be well. Wear a mask.